All right, so we're going to talk about how to mess things up, which is really just about bias, but it's a funny title that the creator of this workbook came up with. We're going to talk about bias, and again, I want to get away from the mindset of the classroom mindset. We have all these fancy names: sampling bias, self-interest study, perceived lack of anonymity. I'm not going to quiz you on any of these, right? Like, I just want you to be able to recognize them, and it's a springboard for us to talk about them. And again, it's even if I were to quiz you on them, it's open book. So I more want you to kind of be able to look for these things and think about them, but don't get hung up on, oh, which option is this, as we kind of go through these examples. So, one of them is sampling bias, a lot, especially if we use convenient sampling or uh, again, what technical word did we use? Voluntary response sampling can a lot of times lead to sampling bias if this sample's not representative of the population. So that's always something you want to watch out for. Does our sample represent our population? Because that's its purpose. Voluntary response bias, kind of a subset, right? It's a sampling bias that often occurs when the samples are volunteers. Self-interest study. This is very, very common. I cannot tell you how many times I've been curious about something. And so I'm Googling to try to, figure something out. And it's like, oh, this website has an interesting study. And then I look and it's like, oh yeah, this study was funded by, the business that's trying to sell you this stuff. And it's like, okay, maybe they're ethical and maybe they're doing a good study, but I don't know that. It's something you want to watch out for. Anyway, that's my own rant. That's a sampling bias that occurs when researchers have an interest in the outcome. Okay. Follow the money a lot of times. It makes some things hard to trust. Response bias is another one where the responder gives inaccurate responses. And there's a lot of reasons why you might do that. If I ask all of my students in a Canvas quiz, how many times per year they break the law, or how often do they lie on their taxes or something, there's going to be some response bias because for a variety of reasons, maybe you don't want to tell your math professor how many laws you break. Right? I would not ask that question, but that's a silly example. Okay. So that's another time that it's something you have to think about. Perceived lack of anonymity is very closely related, right? Where the responder fears giving an honest answer because his or her response might have a negative effect. If your professor asks you a question, I mean, I do this, right? I try to keep this in mind. A lot of times I ask you questions like, oh, how useful is this? And I understand that some students may feel nervous about saying this is not useful. I try to, mitigate that as much as possible, but I understand you might not want to tell me that this class sucks if that's how you feel. And that's okay. Loaded questions, sampling bias when the wording of the question influences the response. We've all seen this in our own lives. And non-response bias, a sampling bias where people refuse to participate in the study. Okay. So let's look at this example, and we're just gonna identify a potential source of bias. So we can kind of use these as a springboard, but you don't have to use any of these words. Okay. So we got a survey, and it asks the person for the number of sexual partners they had in the last year. Okay, so yeah, maybe there's some response bias, right? Maybe people maybe people are lying. There's a perceived lack of anonymity too, right? I don't want my answer to be too low. I don't want my answer to be too high, depending on my own morals and the morals of the perceived morals of the person asking me the question, right? So those are both potential sources of bias. I think I'm just going to verbally verbally go through these and not write them down, but feel free to kind of write them down on your own. A radio station asks listeners to phone in their choice in a daily poll. So again, there's going to be some non-response bias, or more accurately, right? Here's the maybe voluntary response bias. You know, the people who are actually doing this, the people who are actually phoning in, right, are going to be a different type of people than the whole population of the listeners for this radio station, right? A substitute teacher wants to know how students in the class did on their last tests. They asked the 10 students sitting in the front row to state their latest test score. That's not going to be representative of the population, because as someone who always sits in the second row, the front row is a very unique kind of individual that's different from, everyone else, right? No judging or saying anything bad if you're one of those front row students. I love my front row students, but as someone who sits in the second row, I'm not a front row student. They are different from me in general, right? But yeah, shout out to all you front row students. We need you. Every once in a while, I have a class where just nobody sits in the front row, and it's super weird. It's like, I don't think you guys need that big of a buffer from me, but maybe you do. Y'all have a big buffer between me and you now with online. Okay. So yeah. Which one? I just say this basic sampling bias right here, because of the reasons that we said. High school students are asked if they have consumed alcohol in the last 2 weeks. Definitely this one, right? Like, a lot of students are gonna lie. Imagine your high school teacher asking you, "Hey, have you consumed alcohol in the last 2 weeks?" What student's gonna say yes? Oh yeah, all the time, Mr. Ed. That's my fictional high school teacher, Mr. Ed. Okay, so yeah, perceived lack of anonymity. You might have a negative effect to telling your high school teacher that you've been drinking alcohol. You're in high school, you're probably under 21. Last two, the Beef Council, Big Beef, releases a study stating that consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. That's great. This is an example of what I was talking about. Very relevantly, you remember the vitamin D, the sun path activity that we did in the geometry unit? I was researching about vitamin D, but all of these studies that I was reading about were funded by like the supplement companies that sell vitamin D supplements. I was like, this doesn't feel reliable. And I still to this day have not found a study on that was not funded by the people trying to sell their stuff. Anyway, yeah, this is that one. What is it called? Self-interest study. Okay. And the last one is, do you support a new transportation tax? Or would you prefer to see our public transportation system fall apart? Do you support a new transportation tax, or do you hate children? Right, these are loaded questions. There's real specific wording going on right here. Watch out for that. Okay, and that's just an example here. Your answers can vary. You don't need the same answers as I do. You don't need any of these words. It's a springboard for getting you started and seeing common things. Okay, have fun.